A very good afternoon and a warm welcome to the hashtag Love, Sex and Data conference. Apologies for the slight delay in the start. We are on a last and final day of this sexy conference, but we are not done yet and have many more exciting events lined up for today. Do check them out on our website www.lsdindia.com. Don't forget to follow Agents of Ishq and the YP Foundation on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. I am Arzugar and I work at the YP Foundation. Today's session is a panel discussion titled Runaway Desires, GUAVAS, and Crimes. What happens when you don't include pleasure in interventions? Before I go into details of today's session, I would like to make some of the housekeeping announcements. In addition to English, you can access the session in Hindi, Tamil, and Indian Sign Language. ISL interpretation is available on the screen itself. To access audio translation, click on the globe icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can choose the language in which you want to hear the session. अंग्रेजी के अलावा इस सत्र का अनुवाद हिंदी, तमिल और भारतीय सांकेतिक भाषा में किया गया है. अपनी स्क्रीन पर आप ISL में अनुवादित पूरी चर्चा देख पाएंगे. यदि आप हिंदी या तमिल में बातचीत सुनना पसंद करते हैं, तो कृपया अपनी स्क्रीन के नीचे ग्लोब पर क्लिक करें और अपनी पसंदीदा भाषा को चुनें. The conference is a space to rejuvenate, reflect, and learn together. Please engage with an open heart, compassion, respect, even in disagreement. The discussions will engage with ideas and issues of gender, sexuality, desire, as well as prevention of discrimination and violence in an affirming manner. There is a resource list of helplines and referral services available on the conference website. The link of the same is available in the chat box as well. We do not tolerate sexual harassment, sexist and caste slurs, or demeaning language. Anyone who violates this norm will be removed from the conference. In case of any concerns around safety or complaints, you can reach out to the YP Foundation's Internal Committee on Sexual Harassment or the Conference Safeguarding Committee at the email mentioned in the chat. During the session, if you have any question for the speakers, you can ask them by typing in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Please make sure you mention the names of the speakers to whom the questions are directed. We will be having the Q&A session after the panel. Now coming back to this exciting panel that really reminded me of the pleasure that I derived from fruits. But this is not just the focus of this session. Till now, we have had multiple conversations around pleasure, including various aspects of pleasure, pleasure affirmative approaches, and their impacts. This session is a take on the issue from the opposite perspective of what you miss out if you don't talk about pleasure. And we could not think of a better way than making this discussion cross-experiential and have panelists talk about data, legality, and crime together, and how the denial of rights takes away the pleasure from the lives of adolescents and young people. Now, I take this opportunity to introduce you to this amazing list of panelists. We are having Bishakha Datta, Madhu Mehra, and Santosh Desai. Bishakha Datta works on gender and sexuality in digital spaces, runs the non-profit Point of View, writes and films non-fiction. In all her work, Bishakha gets the most pleasure from exploring marginal, invisible, and silenced point of view, or those considered illegitimate. Her documentary work include In the Flesh, a film on the lives of 3 sex workers, and Taza Khabar, which explores a unique woman-run rural newspaper. Bishakha is also a co-founder of Deep Dives, an award-winning online publication, and publishes long-form narratives. Madhu Mehra, who is known for her long-standing and much-needed feminist perspectives within legal system, is a lawyer, heading the research and training initiatives at Partners for Law in Development, a legal resource working group on women's rights and social justice in India. Her work in relation to law explores themes of gender, sexuality, violence against women, access to justice, and the UN CEDAW. She has contributed towards law reform processes relating to sexual violence and harassment, and advocates for decriminalizing homosexuality, adultery, and adolescent sexuality. And last but not the least, Santosh Desai, who is an author, columnist, and media critic. In his professional life, Santosh heads a brand and consumer consultancy company and has previously headed an advertising agency. His principal areas of interest lies in examining the evolving nature of consumer culture in India. He has been writing a weekly column in the Times of India for over 16 years. This exciting panel will be moderated by Manjima Bhattacharjya. Manjima is a feminist, researcher, writer, and activist. She has been a part of Indian women's movement for over 2 decades and has advocated for issues on gender, sexuality, labor, and the body. She is the author of Mannequin, Working Women in India's Glamour Industry and Intimate. I can't wait for this discussion to begin. And without further ado, I would like to request Manjima Bhattacharjya to take over.
Thank you so much, Arzu, and thank you to Agents of Ishq and the YP Foundation for organizing this truly fun conference. It's been a wonderful 2 days so far. And welcome to my wonderful panelists also. I think this panel is, of course, about fruits, as Arzu said. Not really. It's also about many other things. It's called Runaway Desires, Guavas, and Crimes. What happens when pleasure is left out of interventions? And I think we've seen that sexuality, everything rests on a conceptual framework, a lens, a bed of values. And somehow these change, but they also remain embedded in systems. And sexuality is one such area which is very determined by the lens that you look at it with. So whether it's in the violence lens or through a lens of morality, it's always seen to be something that needs regulation. And so I want to start with Madhu, actually, and try and understand, you've worked on laws regulating sexuality, whether it's been homosexuality, rape, and more recently, adolescent sexuality. And maybe you can start by telling us about your research and what you found about these frameworks. Over to you, Madhu.
Thanks, Manjima, and really excited to be on this panel with my co-panelists. So let me just take the example as I address your question, or keeping the research on adolescent runaway couples in mind. I mean, there is all this other research as well, but I think just let's, for a moment, focus on a particular context, and that is the research on runaway couples. And for us, as a law organization, it was, we were coming from a point of concern that in 2012, age of consent had been increased from 16 years to 18 years. And there was a consensus amongst child rights and women's rights groups that this should not have happened. But thereafter, there was silence. As the years passed by, there was concern about how the law on child sexual offences, POCSO, was not being implemented properly, that all the special protection, child protection mechanisms and procedures that were built into the law were not being made available to young victims. So there was a lot of, conversation around that, and research and evidence gathering had begun to happen. But there was a complete silence on what was really happening with those consenting couples that were really now had no, their acts of volition and agency had no recognition in the law, and that they were to be criminalized. So I think we were troubled by that silence. And then, of course, within every, space, there's also a sort of a different kind of, there's no single view. And there was this, what was as default happening is the particular child protectionist view, holding ground that all the girls are, in a sense, coerced into relationships, that these don't happen voluntarily. And the what we keep hearing is behla phusla kar le jate hain ladkiyon ko. So we really wanted to know what the lives of these girls were like when we decided to undertake the qualitative study of 16 girls who were in consenting relationships. And I think that's when your question comes in, that what is the kind of framework we applied to the study. And I think really that framework is important because we wanted to have as much of a 360 degrees understanding as possible. We were not interested in the fact that how many ran away and what, terrible lives or what terrible things happened to them. But we really wanted to understand their lives even prior to the relationship, to understand the context within which these events are unfolding. And we looked at the economic context, the social context across three cities. We looked at the educational, not just what class they studied in, but their relationship with their schools, when they dropped out, why they dropped out, their relationship with their friends. Did they have any friends? What was the relationship like with their family members, particularly their parents, who they spoke to? Did they have anybody to speak to? Did they manage to go out ever? What were the high points in their life? What were the low points in their life? And, that's really, we got a sense of the context within which, when these girls met the boys they did run away with, what that came to mean in their lives. This somebody special who gave time, who gave attention. And, this whole narrative of Behla Phuslakar, I just want to, also put out the other essential questions. How do you understand why these people make certain choices within the limited choices available to them? So additionally, we looked at how they met the boy, whether they were proactive, and how did the relationship pan out. And in that, we looked at also how long the relationship endured and the events that precipitated the running away. So that, it was a long journey into the deep dive into the lives of these young girls. And then we looked at how they experienced the response of the family, the reaction of the family, the child protection system, the formal and the informal, which means the, crisis intervention group, as well as the state agencies, and where the girl is now in her life and how she feels about it looking back. So I think 3 or 4 important points in guiding the inquiry based on this framework was: 1, there were no judgments to be made. We didn't have any questions about what are the violations and what are the, so we were just interested in understanding the narrative of the girl as factually or as much as she felt, how she experienced it. We were just recording that. In terms of methodology, given what the law is, we didn't ask any direct questions about sex. And also, apart from the law, we felt our understanding, we wanted to understand how the girls experienced it, what they felt about the different situations that unfolded, without quite, being voyeuristic. About if there was disclosure, we recorded it. If there was none, that was fine. And we also engaged with the girl through her counselor, because all these girls had been through a civil society organization or, a child protection mechanism through which this crisis had been sort of surmounted. And it was well past her life. So we were not accessing girls in a volatile moment of crisis or accessing her directly, but through counselors who we had worked with and explained the methodology to. So I think that is the framework within which, and it was a very non-judgmental framework. And sometimes it took several interviews to come to a narrative, because remember, these girls are going back to a story after they've long passed it. So basically, that's how we approach the issue.
Just to share with the audience also that your study was with couples who had been sort of called kidnapping cases, or cases under which they were apparently child marriage was happening and so on. So this was actually
so examining the report here.
Yeah. So it was examining, how the law actually operates on the ground. And it's really interesting that you actually brought in the question of consent. So the lens you actually brought in was that of whether girls were consenting, and you were really bringing in a socio-economic lens to understand whose sexuality is being regulated. So I'll come back to you, Madhu. But Bishakha, I wanted to actually know, it's not just how sexuality is practiced on the ground, but also how it's represented in literature or the screen that is also regulated. And I know you and your team at Point of View have been looking into that. So if you could share something about that, and also please reveal what GUAVAS have to do with this.
What do GUAVAS have to do with anything? Okay. Actually, it's interesting because guavas, like any other fruits, can be considered many things, right? I just ate one for breakfast, and I would say it was soft, succulent, and juicy. But sometimes the law defines activities related to guavas as obscene. And that's sort of where I want to come in. So basically in 2017 at Point of View, we did a research study called Guavas and Genitals, which began with this story. It's a story set in Pune about 4 young men, 17 years old, all kind of in college, etc., who landed up in a public garden one afternoon for fun and games, and apparently for some guavas. They were later arrested, and I'll tell you why. But one of them later told the police, 3 of us had gone there to eat guavas, but when we reached there, we started playing with each other's genitals. We then stopped under a tamarind tree where 2 of us had oral and anal sex, while the third shot it on his phone. This was repeated on all 3. After 2 hours, we returned home. Okay, let's leave the juicy segue from guavas to tamarinds aside for now and get to the thing. You know, what ended up happening with this foursome is that they shared the clip that they had filmed of them, engaging in sexual play with 1 or 2 of their friends. And from there, as is very common, this clip actually slipped out of their control and was shared in a WhatsApp group called Worldly Affairs, and somebody complained. And the cops basically then came and arrested these 4 young people who were then juveniles, right? And they were arrested under a section of the Information Technology Act called Section 67, which defines what constitutes digital obscenity. And there is a counterpart in the Indian Penal Code, which refers to what constitutes physical obscenity, right? Which is Section 292. The reason we got interested actually has everything to do with pleasure. So, when we read about this case, we felt that actually the 4 young men were indulging clearly in an activity that was pleasurable for them. And our framework also said that in the digital age, images are very much part of that pleasure framework, right? Because sex or romance is no longer just constituted in physical space, it's also sending images to each other. And if anything, we felt that their images slipping outside their control was actually a violation of their privacy, perhaps, and done without their consent, but it sort of turned on them because sex is somehow considered dirty and filming sex is considered even more dirty. And they ended up in jail in the bargain, right? So that's really pretty much where it all began, sort of really a subversion of pleasure into deviance. Yeah, that's pretty much what I wanted to begin with for now.
Thanks, Bishakha. I think Santosh. So the law clearly takes a very narrow view of sexuality and sex, but the market is perhaps a different story. And from your vantage point as a veteran advertising professional, and from your studies of evolving consumer culture in the middle class, I think it'll be interesting to hear what the market sees as its own, how it frames sexuality and sex. Santosh, you're on mute.
It's interesting that, in many ways, the market begins at the opposite end of the spectrum. As against the idea of regulating desire, the market actually actively works to stimulate desire, because underlying all of the market's activities are in a sense this idea that desire is really the bedrock of all kind of consumption, and therefore beginning from things like packaging. You will find this whole idea of a certain amount of direct, it's a sensory kind of a call. It's a call out to people to kind of come and touch it. And so there is a very tactile sense, of seduction that takes place, beginning with an idea called, like packaging itself, and all the way up. So therefore, on the face of it, you would find, and you would see that desire and in fact, locating pleasure in all kinds of activities is actually what the market does well. So everything, food is presented as pleasurable. Even household chores are presented as being pleasurable. You have an aesthetic kind of a layer that is added to virtually everything. You have a sensory layer that is added to everything. So you will have, a lime flavored toilet cleaner. As to why would you put lime flavor in toilet cleaner is not clear. But the fact that in the idea of evoking desire, I think, is central to the market. And yet, in some ways, the market sexualizes everything except sex. In a certain sense, if you were to look at images of food, if you were to look at images of fashion, across so many categories, you will find that there is a tendency to sensualize the experience. But the market is actually quite inarticulate when it comes to representation of sex itself. Even when it does represent sex, it tends to think about desire and sex in a very generic sense. So individual desire, which is located in people and their everyday lives, is somehow rarely the object of market representation. You will find very rarely you will have images of that kind come forward. What is interesting is that, a lot of the work that we do, talking to consumers across the country, we find that one of the biggest changes that have in fact taken place is the fact that there is, I think, a great sort of almost a discovery of the body, and there is a great engagement with the body itself, and this takes many forms. So whether it is through the lens of fitness and sculpting the body and actually investing in the body, whether it is through the lens of beauty, where the idea of lavishing the body with attention and actually sort of, in a sense, thinking of the body not as a given, but as something that is a project that is always in the making, which is supported by the digital culture, where you are constantly taking selfies, which is, in a sense, a sort of a beta testing of the self. You're rapidly prototyping your own self and locating yourself in different contexts. So you find that kind of an engagement with the body, whether it is food and the amount of pleasure that you derive from food, even through the lens of health. You find, therefore, there is in fact an enormous engagement with the body. So you will find gyms everywhere, you will find tattoo parlors everywhere, you will find, and when I say everywhere, I mean you go to the smaller towns in India also, and you tend to find this tremendous engagement with the body. And yet the market's ability to, and is very comfortable talking, to consumers when it comes to these categories. But any articulation or any acknowledgement of sexual pleasure is something that actually is deemed very difficult. I think it's instructive that even a brand like Tinder, which globally is predicated on the idea of the ease of access to the idea of pleasure, you find that when it comes to India, it has struggled to find a way to communicate what it represents. So in fact, you had this spectacle of it actually trying to present itself virtually as an adjunct to a marriage bureau. In its early days, when it was trying to find what is a way of coming across to the Indian audience. And I think this sense of confusion that I think that exists today partly comes because of a lack of data. There isn't a real understanding of how the young in particular how they are evolving when it comes to their feelings about sexual self-expression. And it partly comes from, in fact, a fear that anything in the public domain, the acknowledgement of sexuality is somehow, gets a cultural backlash that is feared. And therefore, in that sense, the market is deeply conservative. It is deeply conservative, and it is anxious about ruffling feathers. And therefore, you find that when it comes to representations of sexuality, it tends to be either stereotypically generic, but or it speaks in sort of devices like food. So you can have a very sensual representation of food, but you shy away from actually any representation of sex itself. So I'll let it lie here for now.
I think you reminded me of those Kama Sutra condom ads that very much centered pleasure in the 90s. Or even the name Masti spotlighted pleasure, but perhaps it was male pleasure. Perhaps there is a gendered aspect to this definitely as well. And we can get into that in the next round. But even this, what you mentioned about, really we don't know what young people are feeling, thinking, and so on, the lack of data on that. Madhu, I wonder if you would like to talk a bit about why this kind of framing, as you mentioned, in this, in law, that criminalizes actually even consensual adolescent sexuality, and more so with the rise in the age of consent. What impact does it have? Like, what are young people saying? What is the impact on them of these frameworks?
So clearly the impact of silencing young people is to then attribute to them a protectionist kind of framework and say that's what child rights is all about. And also to level off from 0 years to 17 and a half years as the same infantile bracket, where they're all, and then basically superimpose whatever the dominant voice is on of the society. That and this flies in the face of child rights, the convention that India has ratified and everything it stands for. But it works because, if these frameworks are not fleshed out through evidence and through understanding the lives of young people through other disciplines like psychology and there's going to be no really unraveling of what lives of young people or what different disciplines have contributed in understanding young people, children, adolescents, and so on. So I think the framework that I laid out in the last question, I think it completely, in a sense, the findings emerging from that disrupted the narrative that was available to us at the time on young people. For one, that it was a more authentic study of young people who are eloping. It was not in contexts driven by sort of some kind of hormonal upsurge, as is popularly imagined, which is irresponsible and behla phuslakar. But it's a range of different scenarios operating, but mostly and only operating within contexts of extreme deprivation. So it's not as if, middle class and more affluent children are not doing the same thing, but they have buffers. They have so many other things in their life, so many other stimulants. They have they have people they can meet, and they have a completely different set of life chances which are not available to those who are poor. And we found contexts of complete isolation, craving for attention, huge burden of housework, huge burden. Some children were also, young people were also undertaking paid work to supplement parental incomes. And because parents were mostly out of the house, in working class families from morning to night, there was actually no one to speak to. So there was no mobility, absolutely no mobility. Most of them had dropped out of school because of the pressure of housework at home. And also because of the risks attached to mobility, because they were seen with a boy at some point. So we found that the education system really wasn't contributing in any way to addressing the aspirations and the needs of adolescents. If they drop out, nobody finds out, nobody bothers to ask why they've dropped out. So you have the, state education system, which is sort of actually doesn't engage with children who are not very bright or academically inclined. So we found that the young people in question were clearly aware of the risks attached to what they were doing. So however long these relationships endured, there was a lot of effort keeping it secret and concealing and just letting one or two people know, especially for the girl. And that elopements were often, were occurred when circumstances drove people to it, when there was a forced marriage happening, when there was a retaliation by parents on discovery of relationship. And so what we found and what we understood through this was much more than the narrative of, victims and perpetrators and these boys, behla phuslakar, taking away the girls. There was a whole, structural context within which this pans out, context of deprivation, lack of opportunities, lack of resources for which the state is squarely responsible. And that's where the spotlight really should be. What do you do with people from deprived backgrounds? There was a whole, social norm, not just of getting girls married early, but social norm that stigmatized girls' agency, stigmatized girls' relationship with boys, and curiosity about sex and desire to go out. So we found within that context, girls navigating a lot of odds, clearly trying to exert as much control over their lives as circumstances allowed them. And of course, they don't know the risks of the big bad world outside, not having, one age on their side and not having the resources and the means to understand. So they're running away from a bad situation to make it good. And I think that was a huge learning that I would really, I really do think that those easy categories that we have, historically relied on to make a good cause for more law or this policy or that policy. I mean, setting that aside for a moment, if we don't understand the context within which people put themselves at such risk, then we're not going to be able to address those contexts. We can keep locking up people in, shelter homes which mirror their deprivations and locking up the boys, but we're not going to really transform. And in fact, this piece of understanding led us to, we were doing a case law research of how judgments and cases are filed in relation to child marriage. And we really did the whole thing after what we learned from our fieldwork. It led us to rejig the whole framework of the case law data and arrive again at very, very interesting conclusions. So I think to come to a point where you recognize adolescents as a group, as a population group that need protection of children, but must not be infantilized, came through this experience of studying and analyzing, because the law itself doesn't even recognize adolescents; it's just children. So I think, yeah, that I think was the biggest important outcome for us. Thanks.
So couples who are consensually in a relationship, running away is a crime. Bishakha, in your case, what the boys were doing under the tamarind tree led to them being put in jail and is a crime. I want to ask you the same question, Bishakha. So what is the implication of this kind of legal framework? You know, are these really crimes? What's the harm?
Thanks, Manjima. Okay, let me actually start, by asking the participants. I'm going to give you an example, and I would love it if you could answer in chat. This is to all participants. Okay, so let me give you an example. Imagine that you are sending somebody an intimate image by cell phone, right? So you may, on whatever app you use, right? And let's say that you then find that this image, it's a sexy image. Let's say that you suddenly find that this image is no longer just with the person who you've shared it with, right? For your mutual enjoyment and pleasure, presumably, but that it's landed up on a website somewhere or on some other social media site or whatever. The question I want to ask you is this a violation of consent? Is this a case of obscenity? Or do you think it's both? And I would love it if some participants would just write like single words, like consent, obscenity, both, just to get a sense of what you all are thinking, right? Yeah. Moving forward from this, what I want to say, and you can write while I talk, I just want to see if anybody has any thoughts, if you're comfortable sharing. I think moving forward from this, what I want to say is that we found in our study of Section 67 that most such cases, right, where media, media related to desire and pleasure has been consensually produced and often consensually shared with one party. You know, when they leak into the public domain, they are the law does not frame them as violations of consent. So it doesn't see the violation of consent as the primary harm, right? Which is a private harm in a sense. What the law tends to do, and I'm talking about the Information Technology Act, is it typically books all such cases as crimes of obscenity, which is seen as a public harm, right? And in doing so, the real harm, I would say, to young people, the implication of this is that it ends up basically criminalizing desire, attraction, romance, pleasure, sex, sexuality, image making, all of it. Because what it is basically saying, when this gets booked as a crime of obscenity under Section 67, rather than a violation of consent under Section 66E, is it saying you, the person who created this image for your private pleasure, are also doing something criminal by producing an image that it deems obscene. That is the huge problem, right? And I think this has huge, huge, huge implications for young people in the digital age, because, you know, images like words are like the language we speak today, right? And we continuously keep exchanging images. So it sort of takes consensual expressions of sexuality and deems them criminal. That is a huge problem. The other thing that I wanted to say actually is I wanted to show another example of how there's this constant conflation between sexuality, the sexual and the obscene, so that everything sexual is deemed obscene, right? And if the tech team could just project the little screenshot that I shared. Okay, so this is from the National Crime Records Bureau, which publishes a report every year called Crimes in India, and chapter 18 deals with cyber crimes. And as part of our study, we analyzed this. What the National Crime Records Bureau had done is it classifies the people who have been arrested for cyber crimes under a whole bunch of like utterly random headings. And I just want to, before I forget, say, we really have to be careful about data, right? Just because it's a number doesn't mean anything. It can be utterly random. So you'll see one of the classifications which I've highlighted in red is it's basically the National Crime Records Bureau felt that 5.1% of people arrested under the IT Act could be classified under a heading called sexual freak. Now, what the hell does sexual freak mean, right? In a society that believes that the only legitimate sexuality is for reproduction within the confines of marriage and often between heterosexual people, does this essentially mean that anybody who expresses any other form of sexuality, whether it's queer, whether it's polyamorous, whether it's pansexual, that all of us are sexual freaks? So you see again the dangers of these kinds of subjective terms entering the legal framework and governing our sexuality. Essentially, it can render all of us criminal at the stroke of a word, as we saw with Section 377 earlier, right? Subjective terms, right? Yeah, that's that. So I think it's hugely, hugely harmful.
I think even the world of advertising and the market has been affected in a limited way. I remember the Tufts ad with the Milind Soman and Madhu Sapre were a shoe ad called Tufts, that they came under obscenity laws, I think, as from what I remember. But Santosh, even for the market, there are limits. And as you said, it promotes a certain kind of desire, which is limited to class mobility or that towards a certain kind of body, as you indicated. But what is the result of this? What's the outcome on people's minds or on social norms and so on? What is the effect that you feel these have, and what are the limits that they inscribe?
Well, the market is given the fact that it otherwise is predicated on the notion of desire, should have been a powerful instrument of change. I mean, in other areas you would probably never arrogate to the market, such responsibilities. But I think when it comes to desire, I think it is fair to say that there is a certain kind of a role that the market could have played. But I think here the market is conservative, and I think I also want to just add to it a dimension that I think you mentioned in your comments to what I said last time, which is about the gendered nature of representation when it comes to pleasure. And I think that's very true, that the market actually is quite comfortable with very sexualized representations which cater to the male consumer. So you find that there historically has been no dearth of those representations. I think where it has shied away from, and where you see the absence, is it when it comes to representations that actually are about desire at an individual level, which is kind of in a sense located in not just symbolic representation of sexuality, but in actually it as a lived experience. And what is interesting, we just did some study for the Advertising Standards Council of India, looking at at gender representations. And one of the things that we find, which is illustrative of the absence of the notion of pleasure, particularly when it comes to representing women, is that in advertising, women are always shown to be doing something. I mean, at one level, it's a very small kind of an observation. The idea that women simply cannot, leisure is not available to women. So just the pleasure of not doing anything is not, or the pleasure of sprawling. So you will find any number of ads where men are sprawled out. There is a certain casual demeanor. There is the absence of responsibility in men is glorified in a sense. The idea of the irresponsible man is a recurring advertising trope. But the woman, even when pleasurable activities are taking place, is shown to be picking up something, or in the background there is an aura of work that surrounds her, which is this continuous kind of detachment of women from the idea of leisure and pleasure. That is something that is at work. And I find that interesting because it is not about how you represent pleasure, but how the absence of it, and the idea that there is a certain functional necessity that in the world of consumption women must provide at all times, I think is something which becomes. So I think that the question about what it does is the fact that it further reinforces the idea that the pleasure is the domain of a few. Pleasure, in acknowledgement of pleasure, in any social sense, in any collective sense, is highly restricted, both in terms of class and in terms of gender. So you see that at play, across the board. And interestingly, and although I must also acknowledge that there is a reason why the market shies away from it, because exactly for the kind of the things that both Madhu and Bishakha have spoken about, the fact that there was a time when you could do toughs, even if it was hauled up for obscenity, and you could do advertising like that. Today, if anything, the kind of scrutiny that the market comes under, where advertising comes under, and the kind of pressure that is built, thanks to the political environment in the country today, is in fact something that I think does push the market towards even greater conservatism. Also, I think there's the reality of the fact that a lot of women, when we talk to a lot of young adolescents, and we find that there is discomfort about public representations of any form of sexual sort of an instinct that they display, given the reality of their lives, where as it is, there is a great amount of, the idea of safety becomes a very, very kind of a dominant kind of a concern. And the idea of acknowledgement of this instinct or this impulse is often resisted. This is not uniform, but we find this also is often resisted as saying that let's not, on a one-to-one level, I'm happy to acknowledge and have this conversation, but acknowledgement in the public domain or a representation of a public kind does evoke a certain amount of anxiety. So I think the overall effect, I think, is a combination of excessive caution on the part of the market, which in a turn reinforces the fact that the cultural limits that exist in reality in society. So there isn't an agent of change, and the political environment being what it is, I think is in a certain sense further limiting the choices that are available today to the young.
What you said really reminded me of yesterday's workshop on gathering on data from ASHA workers, and however much it was almost like pleasure is a taboo. They spoke about how much work they do, not a moment to sit and have a cup of tea. So it's not just pleasure related to sexuality, but generally just it's as if it is taboo for women, especially in the marital household. So they would say that, they implied that even that at least in the Maika, there is the option of having some aram. But in the Sasural, you cannot be seen. The only way you can rest is through sleep. And that's the only way. Otherwise, if you are, even for a minute, you are sitting just like that, you are, you're a waste woman. You are not. So it really reminded me of that. Okay, I think we'll just do one quick round before we actually open up for questions. And we can go the other way, maybe Santosh and then Bishakha and then Madhu. Maybe just one suggestion for what you think could be done differently so that there is a more empowering frame that includes all these elements that you spoke of. And maybe one personal reflection on what you've done differently with your insights over the years. Santosh?
Yeah. So I think one which I briefly touched upon, which would really help, and I think it's part of the title of this conference is the idea of data. I really do think that more data, which is richer, which actually gives. I think data serves two purposes. One is, of course, in terms of just gauging the fact that and acknowledging the change that is in fact taking place. But the other, what it does is that it gives permission. Because it legitimizes that change, and it crystallizes that change, and it becomes therefore a public document, and it becomes a new benchmark. I think one of the things that you see, in fact, on the other side of the spectrum, is that what social media does, the public nature of social media does, is that it emboldens, say bigotry on the one hand, because a lot of bigots realize that they are not alone, that there's a whole world out there who think just like them. On the other side of the spectrum, it is possible that when there is greater data in the public domain about the fact that there is a new world, there is change that is taking place, what it does is that it allows and legitimizes that change to a much greater degree. So I certainly do think that data, richer data, and greater availability in the public domain would help enormously. I think in terms of a personal reflection would be just the fact that I think one of the things that the research has opened my eyes to certainly is the fact that how much I think is this change, how much the change that is actually taking place is way beyond what is being represented and what is being understood. I think this is something that every time one goes and talks to, and we don't do too much work in rural India, but we do a lot of work in small town India. And particularly when you talk to the young women in small town India, it is astonishing. I mean, I always find myself astonished with the degree to which things have changed. And the recurring obstruction is always about not being permitted, not being allowed, it is never self-doubt. It isn't about any kind of self-doubt at all. It is only about the fact that what the change that you have undergone in your mind, how does that find expression in the world outside? And that's I think one of the things that I think the battle really has been about.
Should I go next, Manjima? Okay, I think I want to start with this very small personal reflection about being and doing, actually. So I saw a little thing on Instagram, which was super, because it was basically trying to say that we don't have to be super high productivity all the time. And it had a little thing saying we are human being, not human doing, right? But that, yeah, just made me, it made the point. But, as we were talking, Santosh, I was really thinking about it, and I absolutely agree with you that women are always portrayed as doing rather than being. And yet, and it's very important that change overall. And yet the paradox is that, in the sexual landscape or in the landscape of desire, women are always portrayed as being or being done to rather than doing, right? So it's that kind of odd thing that we need to think about, like where do we need to sort of, have more doing, and where do we need to have like more being, and all of it obviously overall in the framework of just free to be. But building on that, I just wanted to say that I think the two things that are important, I think one is really foundational. If we want like things to change, it's very hard to understand how things can change unless we recognize desire, sexual desire, and pleasure as foundationally legitimate. And not just when it comes to like eating and, partying and things like that, but really when it comes to sex, not seeing it as something deviant or dirty. And I think the thing that we have really shifted in our practice is we are betting that the world going forward is going to be hybrid or phygital. And we are really trying to get everybody to understand that if we want to build a gender equals, affirmative, sex positive world going forward, it's no longer enough to talk about concepts of consent, bodily autonomy, and integrity only in the physical domain or realm. We really have to think about these in digital spaces as well.
Madhu?
Yeah, so in terms of reflection and our own practice at PLD, I'd say the one thing that we sort of experienced as being very liberatory and as well as lending itself to a lot of learning is to not be trapped by the demands for strengthening advocacy, law reform advocacy. So to be able to be free of when you're sort of doing data collection, doing a research, to not be trapped by that meta framework where one has to reinforce an important point. Because there's violence against women, we must sort of make out a very strong case of violence against women, or to sort of, and also in the stories that we've documented, whether it's about the runaway girls, whether it is about even the rape trial study where we talk to the victims. We were not interested in judging the situation, because many situations are very complex, but to understand what led the person to do what she did, what was the context within which those actions unfolded. So I think to give ourselves that space to texture and nuance realities of people that we wish to intervene in and transform, hopefully in the long run, by understanding that context and not by just defining a violation. So I think, if I use how it influenced our work on consent, that we recognized through all the narratives of young people that there was lots happening besides yes and no. And not all of it was bad. Not all of it was, not one party bore the entire responsibility of failing to understand the signals. And that there was risk-taking and there was, pushing the boundaries. And for us, it's important that whatever the concepts, whether we've got them in law, and that's a big victory, these concepts must be available for community work, for mobilizing, for awareness raising, for equipping young people with skills by which they understand themselves better, by which they relate to the world better. So it's not just about labels, what is a violation and what should be punished, which is very unfortunate, is largely the paradigm we still live in, where, an event leads to a quick judgment and a quick calling out, and there is no effort to really talk and engage with either that situation or similar situations. So I would really hope that in an environment where, which is already so strident in various ways, as even Santosh pointed out, the larger context where everyone is willing to condemn the other person and everything is so polarized. I think more than ever, we need texture, nuance, and conversations, at least in the work we do, without sort of jumping down through these silos of this is a victim, this is a perpetrator, this is a crime, and this needs to be punished or called out, or, so I really don't think that that we will see much transformatory potential in our work if we continue to focus or channel our energies in that direction. We really need to have more empathy and recognize that there's, many of the situations, yes, are demand demand stridency and falling out, but there's also a whole landscape that's textured to not cut up everything and fix it in these two polarized spaces. So I think that's a learning, and that's what I think I would say that share as a message as well.
Thank you, Madhu, Bishakha, and Santosh. That was really wonderful. I think I kept thinking about how we often use the term draconian law, as if laws in the past were worse, or the situation was worse than the new laws. But the raising of the age of consent and having it coincide with the age of marriage, minimum age of marriage for girls, is an example of not very progressive or liberal or real, given the context on the ground. And so I think that, and also the idea that the absence of pleasure in our framework leads to real harm in people's lives. And that's an important thing to underline as well. I want to open it up to questions. Bishakha, you'll be glad to know that 8 people have responded to your question, and they all say it's a violation of consent, which sort of makes your point. But I'm going to actually go to the questions now. Okay, some really good questions. Soumya Rai says, Madhu, I love how you brought in the narrative of consenting girls when it comes to runaway desires. I've grown up in a society where when schoolgirls ran away with boys their age, their mothers walked the walk of shame. How do you feel parents should come to terms with desires they don't understand? And I think maybe you can respond, but Santosh and Bishakha, I think it's an interesting question, really. How do parents actually come into the picture? Madhu, maybe 1 minute, 2 minutes?
Yeah, so I think it's not just the parents, it's also the larger society, the crisis intervention groups, and all of us who set the narrative. But yes, I think there's too much reliance on the law to determine the right and wrong of things. And we need other disciplines to be equally vocal and to draw them into our analysis and work, to understand that at puberty and before, at and after puberty, there is going to be sexual interest, there will be sexual activity and exploration, and there's got to be a capacity to protect young people. They will experiment. That's what they are primed to do at that developmental stage. So they're no longer, the little children. They're transitioning into adulthood, discovering themselves. And I really think, that element is missing, both in the way we educate and reach out to children, young people, adolescents, and in the way we react to them when they take a step that is taboo. So,
can I add to that?
Yeah.
Okay. I think, very similarly to the question that came up and to what Madhu was talking about, every time we go to a rural area to do a workshop around digital security and rights, if it's with parents or teachers, one of the questions we are always asked is, can you please help us, because our children are using mobile phones to elope. And so they want help shutting this down, right? And then we have to sort of reposition it and say, no, the mobile phone is not making your daughter elope, etc. She's just expressing her desires through it. But I think, this is actually an issue that has existed forever. I feel like every single generation, including when I was a teenager, I fought with my parents for more latitudes of desire and, the freedom to do what I wanted to do. And I don't know what the answer to it is, but I think one of the things that is, maybe for parents to sort of rethink parenthood, not so much as policing, right? And reframe it, and perhaps, trusting young people is not a bad idea.
I just want to add, sorry, if I may.
Yes. Go ahead, Santosh.
Just the other side of it, which I think that, mechanisms, parents and I think there is a negotiation taking place. So it's not as if things are static, things are moving. So for instance, this is a very small particular example. We came across this interesting kind of a phenomenon called the bhai friend, which was where there was the old kind of a tradition or whatever of being a Rakhi brother, which allowed for some interaction between the sexes in a controlled way. But this was interesting because it was not Rakhi brother, it was bhai friend. So it sounds like a boyfriend, but this got the legitimacy of parents, and it was a very interesting hybrid solution that had been negotiated, and kind of that negotiation had been hammered out, where you allow so we saw these couple, for instance, go around on a bike and generally behave as if they were a couple, but with this label that kind of gave them some sort of protection. So just to say that there is change and there are mechanisms, and it isn't as if there isn't any change at all. It's only if these kind of innovations become more mainstream, get, I think, more oxygen, so that you normalize the change rather than normalizing what hasn't changed. I think, to me, that would be a principle for just encouraging more people to sort of loosen up when it comes to this.
Great. Madhu, there's a question for you actually, so I'll just bring you in, which basically says, how do you think the concept of pleasure, especially while adjudicating marital discords, should be ensured by Indian judiciary? Similarly, other concepts such as womanly duties in domestic settings that deprive her of leisure time and hence tagged as neglect of family and house. That's the question. I think it's asking, is there any idea of the concept of pleasure when marital discord is being adjudicated? Maybe in adultery, etc., those kinds of cases. You're on mute, Madhu.
Just as a follow-up to the earlier question, I wanted to make a point that in addition to understanding, there's got to be a lot of conversation and information and, education on different skills. So it's not just sex education, we're talking about biology, imparting that knowledge, but to understand people's social location and themselves in relation to society, in relation to sexuality, in relation to so many things, so that the young person is making sense. You're equipping them to make sense of the world as well, so that they're not like completely naive. And that's considered actually in policy a virtue, to keep people absolutely ignorant and naive, so they find their own. So I think that's one of the things parents and schools and all of us should be doing. But in terms of this, how should the judiciary be responding? I really don't have answers, but I do think that this labeling everything, we have a system where divorce is largely only obtainable on fault grounds. So, and that's a very long sort of story in itself. I don't want to go there, but the way our legal system is, we can only, get divorce if there is a ground of fault by one spouse against the other spouse, or if there's mutual consent. We don't have a system where we don't have to give reasons. We just say the marriage is broken down and these two people are parting ways, unfortunately. And for various reasons, valid reasons, also the women's movement or women's rights activists have not allowed for that breakdown of marriage kind of approach, because the argument is women don't have enough protection in terms of matrimonial rights. So we keep the fault theory alive. And the fault theory really means you're pushing the law as it stands, and the judge has to keep looking at every complaint through the lens of faults. So is this a failing by spouse so-and-so, is having an extramarital relationship a failing? And really, I mean, I think there isn't enough conversation in the women's movement space on issues of sexuality. Yes, a large part of our sexuality discourse has been limited to LGBTI and recognition and decriminalizing 377, but not so much on the heterosexual space. So, extramarital affair will divide us. Many of us will see that as a fault. Many of us will want to see adultery as cruelty. And so I personally don't think that should be a ground for dissolution, for going to court and saying, I don't want to remain in this marriage. But it shouldn't be a ground to beat somebody else with, or to say the lack of housework, or khana acha nahi banati ya bachcho ko acha nahi dekhti. I mean, all those things are parenting issues and running the house, which should be gender neutral actually, but have become so gendered, have historically been gendered, and will be, with the court will look at it through that lens. So unfortunately, as long as we have the fault theory, I feel that the judges are going to pin blame. And yes, there is even a gendering within that, whether doing housework is actually not a fault or is it a fault. I mean, that's an opinion. So I think, there's no getting away from that binary.
Yeah. Santosh, there's a question for you from Disha Pinge. How do you see language, more so in the digital space, become a tool for data gathering around expression of pleasure? Any examples you can share of new language of pleasure emerging in middle India, or maybe middle class India is perhaps what she meant. Santosh, you're on mute.
No, I said offhand, I am not able to think of any example of changes that would bring this alive. But I do think that language is perhaps the place to look at for tracking this change, because I think that is in that sense the most it is the most unself-conscious sort of way in which change manifests itself, and therefore tracking changes in vocabulary and modes of expression become actually the most powerful way in which ideas like pleasure can be tracked. So I mean, with a little time, perhaps I could think of something, but offhand, I don't have examples of which bring this alive.
Thanks, Santosh. Bishakha, I want you also to respond to that question if you have any thoughts. But I'm also going to read out this next question from Satya, which is about data, which I feel both you and Santosh and perhaps Madhu may want to respond. We need to acknowledge that more data, richer data, is also a risk for corporate forces and advertising departments, etc., to appropriate and twist, and thus cause harm to open and free exploration and growth. What do the panelists think about this? Bishakha?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think I'm going to try and relate it to the domain of pleasure and desire, right? So we see, for example, that there are many pregnancy apps and menstrual apps or period trackers in the market. And, often when you use a period tracker, you're using it for one reason, right? But it also asks you a number of questions like, how many times a week do you have sex? It sort of classifies acts, right, based on people's answers, etc. So at the same time, while it's providing you a service, it's also in a sense gathering, classifying data or information about your sexual preferences, your sexual life, your sexual behaviors, etc. I think the issue is really, and that of course has a commercial end, right? Because it helps create advertising, profiles are created, it helps with marketing and advertising. I think the real issue again here, if you ask me, is a buried issue of consent. Because you as the user, you know, are not really necessarily aware of why this data is being collected. And you don't really think at that moment about whether you actually want to give this information, whether you consider it somewhat personal, you know, what it is actually. So I think what's happening is that with digital devices and apps, certainly data collection is so insidious and so large scale that it's become very, very hard to actually assert any form of agency over it. And I think that is actually the big battle moving forward.
Santosh, I wonder if you'd also like to respond to this question.
No, I think it's an absolutely legitimate concern, and I think, but like I think Bishakha spoke about the fact that actually it's a concern that you know is I think a central concern of the times. I mean, I think it goes beyond just this specific area. I think any engagement of today, whether it is social, and so any action that we take that takes place digitally has a data footprint. And that data footprint is mined and used. So it's almost like in order to avail of the advantages of being able to express yourself in ways that were not possible earlier, and a whole host of other advantages that I think digital enables, the price that you're paying at all times is the fact that all of that is getting tracked and is being fed back by way of corporate action. So I think, you know, and certainly in this domain that is true. The only thing I'll say in this domain is that I think given the fact that there is such little conversation about pleasure and desire and sexuality, I think there is a part of that I think that data that emerged that if points in advertising was, for instance, since advertising is mentioned there, was able to reflect, I think, a more nuanced kind of a representation of sexual desire, I think there would be an advantage in that. I think all forms of popular culture, if they are able to represent, you know, desire in a more nuanced form, I think that is a step forward. Along with that, it is undeniable that there are costs. I mean, I think this is a tension that we will have to live with and find ways of resolving beyond the question of pleasure and sexual desire.
Madhu, would you like to respond to this question, or should we move to another one?
Yeah, move to the next. Yeah.
Okay, I think this is more or less the last question that I can see here, which is, Santosh, can it be said that the idea of a woman being leisurely and laying back to let a man do all the work is not popular because women are denied leisure, pleasure in advertising and societal roles by extension? Advertisements are a reflection of the collectivist and sexist culture, right? So I think Soumya is reiterating actually what you said, but in case you'd like to say anything or clarify anything, please go ahead.
No, I think so. I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think that's exactly what it is. I think what is interesting, just to add some specific kind of specificity to this, is the fact that even in categories which are apparently representing and are aimed at women and are actually meant or are not, or also speaking to an affluent class, where there is a certain amount of leisure that is inbuilt in the ethos, you still find the idea that women are not allowed or permitted leisure. So it isn't just a function of any necessity. It is simply so deeply embedded that it feels somehow just wrong to somehow have the woman kind of lounging or not engaging in what looks like some form of activity. So I think this is a deeply embedded kind of a stereotype that I think represents itself, even when there is absolutely no need for that kind of a representation.
In fact, it reminds me of what was once defined as obscene by the women's movement in the 80s, in the case of a film called Pati Parmeshwar, which had a woman who was very servile to her husband, and it was censored by the censor board, was banned by the censor board, and the women's movement agreed that it should be banned because the way that the servility of the woman was represented was, to their mind, obscene. And they distinguished themselves from Western feminists who saw obscenity primarily in nudity and so on, as this being an Indian-specific kind of obscenity, the kind of servility that women were expected to demonstrate to their husbands. And it became the foundation of a big case called the Pati Parmeshwar case. I think we can do one last round. We have no more questions. There is a question on the role of parents, etc. I think we've picked that up, as well as the role of media and law. But if there are any final comments from all of you, maybe to each other's presentations as well, we can do one quick round of a minute or two each. Madhu, you want to start?
I don't have any sort of last thoughts, but to say that many of us within the work we do also don't understand the digital world and how to use data and so on. So I would like to see a much greater synergy between different types of actors and skill sets in addressing both issues of understanding, the concerns that have come up in this session, whether it is obscenity, pleasure, or what is risk-free use of the digital medium, and what is safe, and so on. So I would like to see much more synergy in our work to be able to navigate many of these issues. Yeah.
Bishakha?
I just wanted to actually say that there's an answer that there was a question that came up, which I've answered in the answered section, but that's what my final thought relates to, which is, the question was, if you receive an image or a video that may be rather sensual, what is the first thing that comes to mind? Is it obscene or non-consensual? I think buried in here is an assumption that something sensual could be considered obscene very easily, which I don't agree with at all. And I think the dilemma here is that, when we get these kinds of things, they are non-consensual. And we actually believe that the law should start recognizing receipt of non-consensual items as well in the digital age. And that I think we pay a very, very heavy price for pleasure and desire if we start mixing up the sexual and the obscene. So I would ask us to really think about the difference between the sexual and the obscene and try and pull these apart. And consent might help thinking this through.
Yeah. So No, so I think one of the things that I think becomes possible today, while public representation of desire runs into the kind of societal barriers that I think we've spoken about, but I think digital as a form, I think actually opens up a lot of very interesting possibilities. And I think to harness this, I think to a much greater degree, I think, say, for instance, I think initiative like Agents of Ishq, for instance, is an example of what is possible, in terms of by fostering this kind of a dialogue and having a platform where these subjects are discussed in a lived sense, in a very real sense, in a way that is not symbolic and conceptual and cultural. It doesn't wear those clothes. It actually, speaks to people on a one-to-one basis on questions of an everyday kind. I think that kind of an engagement is really what is necessary. I think much more of that. I think that is I think the power that is available today to have one-on-one and peer-to-peer conversations, and I think that would certainly be a place to foster much greater dialogue.
Great, thank you. It was a brilliant panel. I think I'm left with several thoughts, but primarily really thinking about how young people are living their lives today with great constraints, whether it is in their families, in their communities, or within the law as citizens. It feels like, on one hand, they're criminalized, they're seen as carriers of family honor, duty, so many expectations around them. And on the other, the state sees them as, the demographic dividend, and they're going to bump up our GDP and really transform the nation. So it's all instrumental, really. And so it's high time we listen to their voices and really heard about their lives as they live them. Thank you so much. I hope you all had a great time. I hope the audience really got wonderful insights too. I hand over now back to Arzu.